that I'm told that Adam races out to the front of the museum whenever he sees a big yellow school bus. With another busload of eager school-age youngsters. And among other duties, he also writes and edits the museum's newsletter, the Sagebrush Headlight. And Adam has titled his session today, as I started off at the very beginning there, The History of Transit in Northern Nevada, Streetcars, Interurbans, the V&T Transit, and the Transit Today. Please welcome Adam Michalski. Adam.
Well, I'm excited to be here today. Thank you for having me. Stephen, thank you for inviting me today. I'd also like to thank Stephen for his help on this project, and also I'd like to thank Lawrence Meeker for his contributions to this project as well. He was able to provide me with some information about Reno Transit that I was unaware of. So we'll get started right now. All right, so these are some of the topics we'll be covering today. We'll be covering streetcars in Reno, Interurbans, V&T Transit, and then we'll also talk about a little bit about transit today in Northern Nevada. So this is Reno at the turn of the century, and so what was Reno like at that time? Population in Reno at that time was 4,500. And then by 1910, the population had increased to over 10,000 people. So in a matter of a decade, it more than doubled. Mining was still a big industry in Nevada at that time. And the Tonopah and Goldfield mining booms were also occurring at that time. Also in the Reno area, we had the Newlands Project of 1905, which was developed to divert water from the Truckee and Carson rivers to the Lahontan Valley and over to Fernley for agricultural purposes. So you had a mixture of mining and agricultural business going on. And then also Reno was becoming a hub for Northern Nevada. So there was all these things going on in Northern Nevada that you can't even say the word, necessitated better transportation throughout the region. And then you also had the development of Sparks. Sparks was formed in 1904 with the move of the SP division offices from Wadsworth. And then you also had the Sparks population in 1910 was about 2,500 people. And so with that, with all this development in the area, there was definitely a need for better public transportation. So as most cities at that time turned to streetcars. And streetcars, they were invented by Frank Sprague in 1887. And the first streetcar system was installed in Richmond, Virginia in 1888. And within 3 years, over 200 streetcar systems were either built or proposed in the United States. And by 1900, 15,000 miles of streetcar were built in the United States. So within a period of about 13 years or so, you had 15,000 miles of streetcar and over 200 systems operating in the United States. It was a very rapid and widespread adoption of this technology. And the company that started out here was the Reno Traction Company. It actually started out as the Nevada Traction Company. In Reno, several streetcar franchises were proposed in the late 1880s and throughout the 1890s. However, the early proposals were either mule or horse-powered conveyances. Later proposals were for electric streetcars. One even proposed to build an electric streetcar line from Reno all the way out to Ollinghouse, which is near Wadsworth, which would have traversed through the Truckee River Canyon. I would have loved to have seen that. That would have been pretty an interesting ride. However, none of these proposals took off. But then in 1904, the Nevada Transit Company started construction on a line between Reno and Sparks. And so this is the line that ran from between Reno and Sparks. The track was 4.5 miles long, and it started along B Street, which used to be Harriman Avenue in Sparks. Let's see if you can. So it kind of starts over here. It started over by the Roundhouse in Sparks, made its way up B Street, and then it eventually made its way to 4th Avenue into downtown Reno, and ended at the SP Depot. And as workers laid track, 3 streetcars were purchased from San Francisco. This is one of those cars, and there's some thought that these may have been former cable cars that operated in San Francisco. We're not sure about that, but they look pretty close to cable cars from that era. And the cars themselves were a bright yellow color. So the line officially opened on Thanksgiving Day, and that was November 24th, 1904. And this is a photo from that day. There were over 3,000 riders on that first day, and the ride was 10 cents a ride. And the rides took approximately about 15 to 20 minutes to get between Reno and Sparks. And this is a picture outside the car barn. The car barn was located at 4th Street and Morrill Avenue between Reno and Sparks. It was a wood frame structure, and it housed up to 6 cars. Today, it's the site of a restaurant supply company, if you've ever driven past it. It's just east of where I-80 crosses over 4th Street. And then here's a map of the lines that the company eventually built. Let me just grab my laser pointer. So the original line is the green line that comes in through downtown, and then it makes a left turn here on Sierra, and then another left turn, and gets to the Reno Depot. And then you've got the red line. That was the next extension. That went down to Pine Street. Then eventually it was extended to Liberty. That was in 1905. And then you have the purple line on here, which was an extension on Keystone Avenue. So that came all the way down here, and it went down towards present-day Idlewild Park. That was completed in 1906. One of the funny things about the inaugural run of that line was that they started service on December 30th, 1906. And the last train of the day, the last streetcar of the day, got to the end of the line, and it was snowing, and they couldn't see the end of the track. So it went off the track at the end of the line. The motormen just decided, oh, I'm just going to leave the car here instead of taking it back to the car barn. And then in the morning, they had to come out and they had to bring another streetcar out and tow it out of the snow. Then we have this extension, this blue line. This is in 1907. This ran up to UNR. It went up 9th Street and then east on Center Street to the entrance of UNR. And then there's another line, this pink line. This is an extension that was built in 1907 to connect to the Nevada Interurban, which we'll talk about later. That went down Virginia Street and then made a right on California to Plumas. And then we have the orange line right here. This line went to the Wells neighborhood. There were numerous developments over here starting at the time in 1909, 1910. And so they constructed a line that went there. And then there was also another line over here that was extended to Ralston. This line ends at about present-day I-80, just west of the St. Mary's Hospital complex. And then finally there was a yellow line up here. This is the fairground line. That line was a little bit unusual. They just put that in seasonally. They would lay the track during the summer months when they had the fairs out there, and then they would remove the track at the end of the season. So they basically operate that off of a temporary track. And the entire system itself totaled about 7.5 miles. Let's try to advance this. I don't want to advance. Have it backward? No. Oh, there we go. All right, and so this is an example of the Reno Traction Company's streetcar schedule. Service was handled about every half an hour on the Sparks line. So there would be a car that would leave at 6:30 in the morning, then would get to Reno, and then get to Reno, and then come back and go to Sparks about every half an hour. And that service lasted until 8 p.m. And then after 8 p.m. until midnight, there was a car about once every hour. And then you can see all the different types of service that they had throughout the rest of the city. They used about 6 cars each day. There would be 2 cars on the Sparks line. There'd be another, and then there would be 1 other car on each other line throughout the city.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is an example of a streetcar heading south, about to cross the Southern Pacific tracks at Sierra Street, arriving from Sparks. About 80% of Reno Traction Company's business was on the Sparks line. And most of this was commuters and shoppers going from between Reno and Sparks. And here is an example of a streetcar that's ready to head to Reno from the Sparks terminal outside the SP Roundhouse. And as you can see on the side, there's a banner for Whelan's Park, and that was one of the big places that you could take the streetcar. And so you could take this car to Whelan's Park. That would be Coney Island as well. It was also known as Coney Island. This was a park that was about halfway between Reno and Sparks. And the fare to get to the park from either Sparks or Reno was 5 cents. And the amusement parks were a very big opportunity for transit companies to provide weekend service, to bring in some money over the weekends. Because most of the business obviously was during the week with commuters and shoppers, so this was a good way for them to get a little bit more cash out of their systems. There's all sorts of fun stuff going on there too at the park. Finally, unfortunately, the Reno Traction Company came into decline. The decline of the streetcars at Reno Sparks began around 1917. And annual revenues around that time were about $10,000 a year, and their expenses were close to $18,000 a year. So they were not doing too well at that time. In 1919, the Reno Traction Company petitioned the Public Service Commission to abandon all lines except for the line between Reno and Sparks. Despite numerous protests and Nevada Supreme Court challenge, the Public Service Commission gave permission to abandon the lines on January 15, 1920. So after that point, the only line left was between Reno and Sparks. And the service continued to decline on the Sparks line. The Public Service Commission received numerous complaints about unclean cars and drafty windows during the winter time. In 1925, the terminus in Reno was cut back from the SP depot, and it was the line was stopped at Sierra Street, Sierra and 4th Streets, and this was at the recommendation of the City Council. The Reno Traction Company liked this agreement very much, so that was one little bit less track that they had to cover. However, at that time, after they did that, business declined sharply. And so on June 25th, 1927, buses started to operate on the route between Sparks and Reno. And this sounded the death knell for Reno Traction. And on September 2nd, 1927, the Public Service Commission allowed the Reno Traction Company to abandon all of its services between Sparks and Reno. And it was very quickly after that, on September 6th, that was the last day, September 6, 1927, that was the last full day of operation for Reno Traction Company. One of the interesting things on the last run, which I thought was amusing, on the last run into Sparks at midnight, the motorman tied down the whistle for the last few minutes of the run. And many residents in Sparks were upset about this. And eventually the police chief had to come out and quell the crowd. But at that point, what was it going to do? What were they going to do, shut down the line? Well, it was going to shut down anyway at midnight. I don't know, I thought that was amusing. But the riders enjoyed it. They had a really good time with the motorman doing that, so they were very pleased. All right, next. All right, thank you. Next, we'll talk a little bit about interurbans. And I hope that this isn't too crazy of a topic for a group of people that really enjoy STEAM and the VMT and all. Hope I don't get thrown out of here or not invited back. But anyway, just talk a little bit about interurbans. And John Dew and George Hilton, they were the foremost historians on the subject of interurbans in the 20th century. According to them, interurbans shared 4 key characteristics. 1, they used electric power. 2, their primary emphasis was on passenger service. 3, they used heavier equipment than streetcars, and they were also faster than streetcars. And finally, 4, they could operate on city streets, but also operate on private rights-of-way in the suburbs and in rural areas. So they were a little bit different than streetcars, and they were most of them were built in the Midwest. There was a big building boom of between 1901 and 1907. There was a big building boom of interurbans, and over 7,000 miles of interurbans were constructed during this period. And America's first interurban was the Newark and Granville Street Railway of Ohio. That opened up in December of 1889. So between 1889 and 1907, there were over 7,000 miles of track constructed. And the vast majority of it was in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. This is an example of the Chicago North Shore in Milwaukee, which would have run through my backyard. I'm originally from Wisconsin, so this would have been running through my area back in the 1950s and 60s. By 1916, the interurban route mileage peaked at 15,580 miles. So during this very short period of time, the interurbans really took off. It was rose fast and then crashed pretty immediately after that, very shortly after that. Advance. Right, thank you. We have 2 main examples of interurbans nearby. One is the Pacific Electric. That was down in Los Angeles. Many of you are probably familiar with that. And that was the largest interurban system in America. That comprised of over 1,000 miles of track. So if you think about it, for 1,000 miles of track, and there were over 15,000 miles about 15,000 miles in the United States, this one system comprised of about 6% of all the total trackage in the United States. This service shut down in 1960. And then the Sacramento Northern was another one that operated from Oakland to Sacramento and up to Chico. Interurban service there ended in 1941. However, it did remain a valuable freight hauler after that with the Western Pacific Railroad. And interurban use declined rapidly after World War I due to the rising popularity of automobiles and to the onset of the Great Depression. By the start of World War II, about 3,000 miles of interurban remained, and by 1959, only 209 miles remained. Today, only one interurban remains, and this is a photo of that. That's the Chicago South Shore and South Bend Railroad. So what does this have to do with Nevada? Well, there were proposals for various routes in Nevada, and we'll talk about them here. There was proposed routes to Steamboat Hot Springs, Riverside Railroad Company, up to Lake Tahoe. There was even one out in Fallon, and then there's only one of those lines ever completed, which would be the Nevada Interurban. First, I'll talk about the Steamboat Hot Springs. Captain J.W. Hopkins, he received a franchise to build an electric railway from Reno to Steamboat Hot Springs in December of 1903. And he planned to develop a hotel there, but the project stalled for several years. Then in August of 1907, the property and the franchise were sold to George Phoenix. He was a local developer here in Reno. And Phoenix had grand plans to include a sanitarium at the Steamboat Resort, as well as a hotel. However, all of these plans went nowhere. Now, I enjoyed this one quite a bit, and I've never been able to find any other information about this beyond this article. In 1908, George Phoenix talked of building a new electric railroad down to the mining developments at Jumbo. And the V&T stepped in because they regarded the Jumbo area as their territory. So they decided, so the V&T said that they would electrify their route to Carson City, which effectively ends all discussion of an interurban between Jumbo and Steamboat, which, I don't know, I find this very fascinating. I've been trying to find other information about this. I went to the UNR collection, the V&T collections at UNR, and I couldn't find any other information about the possibility of electrifying the line between Reno and Carson City. But I was just I was thinking about it a little bit more, and I was thinking, like, what if they bought box cabs instead of the 27? I was like thinking, oh, I know. What would that be like? I don't know, but it's kind of an amusing thought there. But so either way, this project never went anywhere, and I have been unable to find any other information about it other than this article. I believe this is from the San Francisco Call, and I have not been able to find anything else about this. Move on. Next, we'll talk about the Riverside Railroad Company. In August of 1906, there were plans to build the Riverside Railroad Company along Keystone Avenue in Reno, crossing the Truckee River and out to Lawton Springs, which is west of Reno. Eventually, they scaled back the project and just wanted to build to Mayberry Ranch, which would be near present-day McCarran and Mayberry. In 1907, bridge piers were placed at present-day Idlewild Park, and 2,000 feet of track were laid. The project never moved beyond that, and then eventually faded. I went down to Idlewild Park because I had heard about the bridge piers, and I looked at Google Maps. I've looked in David Myrick's book, and I kind of approximated this as the location of where the bridge piers would have been. Keystone Avenue kind of ends just on the other side of the other side of the river there. This is looking east across the river. So I was thinking that this might be the point where they may have had bridge piers here, but I can't tell for certain, but that looks about as close as I can get to approximation of where they might have had the bridge piers. Okay, move forward, thank you. Next, we'll talk about some service that they were planning to Lake Tahoe. In 1906, 1907, there were several proposals for interurbans to Lake Tahoe. George Phoenix, after he decided he wanted to continue building up beyond Steamboat Springs, he decided he wanted to construct an interurban connecting Reno to Glenbrook, and that route would have gone over Mount Rose. And he only thought it would take about $400,000 to do it. I'm not sure what that would cost in today's dollars, but I can't imagine it would have been enough at that time either. Later, a group of Eastern investors surveyed an interurban route to go all the way around to circumnavigate Lake Tahoe. Then also there were some other lines that were proposed. One was a line from Reno to Brockway, which would be near Crystal Bay. Another one was proposed by Thomas Rickey. He was a banker and rancher here in Carson City. And he proposed a line from the state prison to downtown Carson City with a connection to Carson Hot Springs and then up to the line that went to Brockway. However, none of these ever panned out. Next we talk about the Fallon Electric Railway Company. And so that's the line this is right here from Fallon, went up to Stillwater, and then another proposal down to the Sand Springs district. Fallon was looking for a better transportation source to get agricultural products to market. And at that time, all they had was a branch on the Southern Pacific, connecting it to the rest of the world, but they felt it was inadequate for transportation in the region. So in May of 1913, Dr. C.A. Haskell proposed building the Fallon Electric Railway Company with 2 routes. So the first route would be the one from Fallon up towards a development at Stillwater, which is about 7 miles from town. And then there was another route. This would go down to Harrigan, about 7 miles, and go east about 31 miles to the Sand Springs mining district. And the railroad proposed using Edison storage battery cars. So these were actually they were cars that you could recharge at the end of each run. So that meant you didn't have to have overhead catenary for the cars. You could just charge them, kind of like I guess you would a Tesla or something like that. You would charge it before the run, then you'd take it out on the run, have it come back, and then you would charge it up at the end of the day. So that sounds like the Edison storage battery cars were not very popular. I think a few railroads had them, but they did not work very well. And the main reason being that the batteries didn't hold their charge very long. And also because of a shortage of funds, much of the construction was done by volunteers. They had a volunteer labor force that consisted of local farmers. Funds would be used for major items such as bridges, rails, and ties, and things like that. The company focused on grading roadbed to Harrigan and to Sand Springs. And volunteers actually graded 17 miles of roadbed by 1915. Part of the roadbed followed Harrigan Road in Fallon. So this is Harrigan Road today in Fallon. If you can go out there, there isn't much evidence of an interurban line or the grade for it. But yes, there's not much exists of the roadbed today in Fallon. And then this is a photo that was taken off of Highway 50, and it's near Salt Wells. It's actually between mileposts 42 and 43 on Highway 50 if you were to happen to go out there. The roadbed followed the foothills off in the distance, so the actual roadbed would be somewhere out here. I didn't trek across there to find out if it was actually there. And you can kind of tell on Google Maps, if you look at it, that there could be a roadbed out there. But then I'd had trouble tracking it all the way back into Fallon from that point. But around World War I, with World War I on the horizon and lack of funds and an insufficient population in Churchill County, there were only 2,811 people in Churchill County. This eventually led to the demise of the railroad, and so plans went no further than that. And then the scheme died permanently in 1916 when Dr. Haskell moved to Montana. I think he got a government job up in Montana, so probably better got more money that way than working on this development. So in general, around this time, interurbans were failing and out of favor. And finally, we get to the Nevada interurban. The Nevada interurban was the only interurban built in Nevada, and even then, it would probably be considered more of a glorified streetcar than an actual interurban. It was built in 1907 by L.W. Barham. He was a former sheep rancher. And the line connected Moana Hot Springs to downtown Reno. So here's the map. So the line itself would make its way from Moana Hot Springs up Plumas, and then make a right on California, and then make a left on Virginia Street, and then end it at the depot. The trackage from here, from Plumas in California, this was all Reno Traction Company tracks. The line's primary purpose was to serve the Moana Baths, and then the baths were a few blocks. These baths were a few blocks west of Virginia Street on Moana Street. The Nevada Interurban took in $14,000 in 1908, but revenue fell sharply to $5,000 per year by 1917. In 1918, the line ended operations during the winter because there was a lack of business. And then with the Reno Traction Company's abandonment of its lines south of the SP Depot in 1920, Nevada Interurban had no route into downtown Reno. So eventually that line died out, and the last run to Moana Hot Springs was in October of 1920, and the Nevada Interurban shut down after that. And we'll talk about the V&T Transit. The V&T was facing increased competition from buses and automobiles, especially after the opening of a concrete highway between Reno and Carson City in 1922. The V&T employees Frank Murphy and Samuel Bigelow started the Reno, Virginia Transportation Company on May 26, 1925. Murphy became president of the company, and Bigelow was the secretary and traffic manager. The first bus was delivered to Western Body Company in Sacramento in May of 1925, where it was outfitted with a sedan body on an REO motor car chassis. And then from there, the bus seated about 14 passengers, and service began on June 24, 1925, between Virginia City and Reno. And on January 3rd, 1928, the name changed to Virginia Truckee Transit Company, and became a wholly owned subsidiary of the V&T Railway. Here is a photo of one of their buses up in Virginia City. And they also had a partnership with Crumley Transportation Company. This was a partnership that operated buses to Tonopah. And that partnership only lasted about a year, from May of 1929 until May of 1930. Here's an example of a V&T Transit timetable from 1931. You can see they combine the train service along with the bus service on this timetable. The V&T operated buses from Reno to Virginia City, and via both Carson City and the Geiger Grade. It also operated bus service to Carson City, Yerington, and then down to Hawthorne. And they also added summer service from Reno and Carson City to Camp Richardson via Spooner Summit. These services allowed the V&T to expand its footprint allowed them to expand their footprint to serve more locations without having to build more railroad lines. V&T Transit services were similar to that of the train service. They handled passengers, they handled parcels, and they also handled mail. The transit line also provided an opportunity on September 22nd, 1929, to shift the V&T daily trains number 1 and 2 to the Reno-Minden route instead of the Reno to Virginia City route, which had declining traffic. Additionally, Sam Bigelow purchased secondhand buses to replace worn-out vehicles, V&T vehicles, between 1939 and 1940. However, even with some of these changes, the business was not very profitable, and the V&T Transit followed the V&T Railroad into receivership from 1938 to 1946. V&T Vice President and General Manager George Sampson was concerned about competition from privately owned automobiles and Greyhound. And so he decided on December 31st, 1947, the V&T Railway would be sold to, the V&T Railway would sell V&T Transit to Vernon Durkee and James Wood of Reno for $25,000. Durkee was originally Greyhound's former agent in Reno, and he had experience in bus operations. They continued to operate V&T Transit even into the 1970s, so this even outlived the V&T by a number of years. V&T Transit then became part of Peerless Stage Company, which no longer exists today. And V&T Transit had some modest success, but ultimately proved unsuccessful from a financial standpoint for the V&T Railway. And then we'll just talk briefly about transit in Northern Nevada today. This is an example of RTC Ride. In 1978, the Regional Transportation Commission in Washoe County, they took over bus operations from the Reno Bus Company, which was a private corporation. The Reno Bus Company served the area from 1941 to 1978. And this service, the RTC, started in 1978 with 5 buses on 4 different routes. Today, the bus service RTC Ride serves 8.4 million riders on 26 routes using 70 buses each year. And the service area includes Reno and Sparks, with there's also another bus that runs between Reno and Carson City called Reno Intercity that serves commuters along that route as well. And then there's also Jump Around Carson. This service started in 2005, and these buses serve Carson City on 3 various routes, and it also connects with service from RTC Intercity and the Tahoe Transportation District. And finally, the Tahoe Transportation District. This is a joint agency between California and Nevada, and this provides service, transportation and transit service up at Lake Tahoe. Bus routes connect South Lake Tahoe with Gardnerville and Carson City, and summer service includes buses from Sand Harbor to Incline Village. All right, thank you. Do you have any questions? Yes?
Well, you mentioned the temporary line out to the Interurbans.
Yes.
I'm curious how they managed, what they did to put down and take up the track and how they managed the overhead.
That's a good question. I'm not totally sure how they did that. I believe that they would put out temporary track. I don't know how they did that. I wonder about that myself with the catenary. If they could just string it from poles that were like electricity poles that were already on the street. That might have been a possibility. Maybe even a third. I can't imagine a third rail. That probably wouldn't work. I think that they may have had they installed the catenary over the line and then just used it during the summer months. I'm not sure how they did that. It's a good question. I should find out more about that.
Thank you.
Yep. Yes.
Again, back to the Reno Traction Company.
Yeah.
How did they handle the grade crossings with the SP and the V&T?
That's a good question. I'm not sure how they answer that. I want to say they may have had diamonds. I'm not sure if that photo shows it at all. But I would think that maybe there might have been I think they installed a diamond I believe they installed diamonds over the tracks.
They had a diamond with the V&T.
Yeah.
They had to have the same with SP.
Yeah, they would have had one with the SP as well too. I think that was one of the big sticking points when they were starting service. They were only able to go up to the SP tracks, and then they installed the diamond, and they were able to cross the tracks at that point once they were able to do that.
Probably why they cut back.
Why did they cut back?
When they cut back
Oh,
on the north side, probably because of,
Yeah, the maintenance on that.
yeah.
Yes.
I just wanted to share 2 short stories that I know. My ex-husband painted a mural of Alice Ramsey crossing the desert with her 3 companions. She was the first woman to drive across the country in her Maxwell Briscoe.
Oh, nice.
So she did all the maintenance with her advanced man, and so they came across the desert and they broke an axle somewhere out in the desert. But anyway, so as they finally got to Sparks, there was electricity, there were street lights, and there was a streetcar system, and they said, "We have returned to civilization." The second story I want to tell you is I talked to a man who was, as a young boy, saw the streetcars after they were abandoned, and in his words, he said they were stacked up like matches.
I've heard about that, and I was wondering, somebody I talked to said they were still
There weren't
around.
that many cars, so
No.
it sounds like a little bit of an exaggeration.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are only about 6 or 8 cars, but, yeah, that would be interesting to see. And I like the thought of Sparks being civilization, too.
Still struggling.
Any other, yes?
The use of electricity on the west coast, western states, did they ever use direct current?
I believe they were using direct current for these cars.
Oh, okay, it was direct current,
Yeah.
it wasn't AC.
Right, yeah. AC came along a little bit later for
Yeah,
the
Westinghouse
cars.
and Edison bought that over, I know,
Yeah.
right over.
Yeah, they would, in that time, I think they would convert over from AC to DC for the current, yeah. Like
But
for example, like the Milwaukee Road up in Montana, Idaho, and Washington, they used direct current at that time, when they were building.
Yeah, direct current is the streetcar form of current used, still is.
Is that still the
Direct
current?
Is that right? Oh.
Yeah,
Is it-
I mean, there should not be a question if it's for a streetcar
Yeah.
current.
Yeah, so they used direct current at that time.
600 volts DC.
Yeah.
Did they have their own powerhouse, or were they buying it from a local utility?
I think they were buying it from a local utility, yeah. I'm not sure which one at that time.
When they started to go up a hill, the lights would have gone down.
Yeah.
There was a powerhouse downtown.
Yes,
The last traditional interurban in North America was actually Canada.
Hmm.
Across the Niagara Peninsula, the Niagara, St. Catharines, and Toronto.
Okay.
Lasted until 1959.
okay, thank you. Any other questions? All right. Oh, and I just wanted to say one other thing. I work at the Railroad Museum, the Nevada State Railroad Museum, so feel free to come out there this weekend. We've got number 25 running for our Harvest Train celebration. So I think you'll all be here this weekend for that. And there's also a discount in the store if you show your credentials for the conference, 15% off in the store. So that's all I've got, and thank you for having me here today. Appreciate it.